IVM.
Welcome to the first episode of Mind the Gender Gap, a podcast over 6 episodes in which we will look at data and evidence to explore essential questions about women and work in India. Mind the Gender Gap is a collaboration between IWWAGE, a research initiative of LEAD at Krea University, an action-oriented research center, and India Spend, the country's first and only public interest data journalism initiative. I'm your host, Sunaina Kumar. I'm a journalist and researcher, and I have been preoccupied with the question which is at the heart of this series and of our episode today. What keeps Indian women from joining the workforce? According to an IWWAGE report from 2020, the year of the pandemic, only 1 out of every 5 women of working age in India were in the workforce. 90% of women in urban India are not employed. Neither are they actively seeking work, nor are they willing to work. Government data shows that between January to March 2021, women's presence in the workforce had dropped to 16.9%. And it's not just the pandemic. Women have been dropping out of the workforce in India or being pushed out for decades. But what lies behind these numbers? What about the fact that most of the work that women in India do is in the informal sector? It is invisibilized and not counted. Or that the time spent by Indian women on domestic work is 10 times more than men? If India leaves women out of the economy, it cannot progress. How can we move forward from where we find ourselves? It is my pleasure to welcome our very special guest today. Sharon Buteau is Executive Director at LEAD at Krea University. Sharon is an economist and has worked for close to 2 decades in research and international development. She has a special interest in financial inclusion. And I can't think of anyone who is better placed to try and unravel some of these questions that we have been grappling with. Welcome to the show, Sharon, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Suna. It's a pleasure to discuss on a very important topic and a topic that's very close to my heart.
I just want to thank you. I know that you're based out of Chennai, but you're joining us from Montreal, and it's pretty late in the evening for you. But this is very much your favorite subject. So we are going to dive right in, Sharon. And what I wanted to start with is there is an essential contradiction here. Women's participation in the Indian economy remains alarmingly low despite economic growth in the country, a decline in fertility rates, and a steady rise in the literacy levels of women, all of which should have led to more women working, but it hasn't. So where are the women and what explains this?
So I think there are several factors at play. There's a range of interconnected issues that we can explain this, and they range from economic and social factors at both the household and the micro level. So at the micro level actually is indicated for the whole economy, and I guess both gender is the Indian context. There's a lack of good job opportunities, lack of, I would say, entrepreneurship growth support. There's issues of social mobility and obviously poverty as well that serve to exacerbate this situation for women. Having said that, there is still above and beyond that structural problems for women where they face a multiple range of challenges to access employment, such as the choice of work, working conditions, employment security, wage parity, I would say discrimination, I think balancing competing burdens of work, family responsibilities. And again, as you mentioned, they're really heavily represented in the informal economy, where they're exposed to probably more risk of exploitation, marginalization, and as well, since there's no form of social protection in the domain in the informal sector, it's even more riskier. I would say as well that currently, as an economist, I would say there's sort of like a U-curve shape where there's a lot of jobs for the very, very low skill and some jobs for the highly skilled, but remains in the middle where the bulk of the women are. There seems to be sort of like an opportunity mismatch where maybe their education level or there's no jobs that are appropriate for them or they're not well represented in those jobs as well. There's also some economic aspects of this. Since economy did experience some growth, that also means that the household level income has increased, which also means that since in India, a lot of decisions pertaining to women are at the household level, and women sometimes have less agency. They also have less voice if the household income increases and their income remains relatively low compared to the rest. So that also prevents them to be able to grow. There's also aspects that are very real in terms of mobility. I think mobility, women have less opportunity or less decision making in terms of traveling alone, for example, or going to remote places. And within that, you also have safety. I think safety is an issue that we don't think of necessarily in terms of labor, but when you think of it, it is a huge factor. I think the fear of violence at work in public places is huge and is a latent factor that really prevent women from wanting to explore opportunities. A recent study, I think, was done last year by one of prominent economists who demonstrated that women actually made educational choices at the graduate level based on the safest area for them to go to education and not based on the prestige of the university, which means at the offset, they also prevent their chances for further growth just because they fear going into public places for something that would advance their career and their own thing. As well, I think there's other aspects. When you talk about employment, I would keep in the wide range of like entrepreneurship, which is a form of employment. Women own less land. They have less wealth accumulated. They often don't have enough bank accounts, access to credit, access to maybe even mobile phones or internet that would help them within their business or their job search. So I just put one of the many elements, and I think every element I think would be sort of like another point of discussion, but this is just a broad overview of I think what the situation is for this one.
Well, thanks for laying that out for us. And as you said, there are so many elements and it's such a complex topic. There are economic reasons, as you just laid out for us. There are social reasons. There is the context of mobility and safety. And I find it interesting that the study you brought up, I had seen it and I'd been fascinated by it about how young women were choosing education institutes based on where the institutes were located and if they can get there safely. And I think what the study managed to do was show that how that also impacts not just their educational choices, but also their future and their prospects in the job market. So, Sharon, there is so much to unpack in this conversation. It's such an important topic as well. And I hope that we will be able to cover some of this. You brought up the question of the informal economy. And we know that women are not in the workforce for many of the reasons we've just looked at. But also, many women who work are not counted and are invisible. And for that, we have to understand the nature of women's work in India. According to IWAGE research, 94% of women who work in India are informal workers. They work as daily wage agricultural laborers at construction sites, as self-employed micro entrepreneurs, or are engaged in home-based work. India's Spend has reported on many such stories, like that of Samina, who is 33. She lives in Delhi and is one of the many female hidden workers of India. She works from home. She fits locks on zippers for a garment factory. She works 12 hours a day and earns about 3,000 rupees a month, which is an average of 100 rupees a day. And she does this to support her family and the education of her three children. In a developing country like India, women work on farms, on livestock, in family enterprises, in handlooms, handicrafts, and in all forms of unpaid economic work. So, Sharon, I want to ask you about unpaid economic work or the workers who remain invisible in India, especially women. Why is this work not being accounted for and how can it be measured?
Thanks, Susan. Another great question. So I'll start with similar response that I said we could have like in the same context. Actually, India is in general a country of informal workers. I would say 95% of the workforce is actually informal. And I think that's the crux of the main problem again. However, I think for women, again, it's more exasperated, I think, because they have much more volatility in terms of their employment trajectory. They also face much more contextual aspects and lifestyle stages that men don't have. So, for example, when you look at women before marriage, during marriage, with young children, older children, and then I guess when you have the stage of older women who also are difficult to find jobs and things like that. So the context of employment for women is different, how they employ what they do. As well, one of the big aspect is the aspect of unpaid work is still not well understood in India nor accounted for. And a lot of the surveys actually do not measure it or take it for account as well. They would mostly rely on, work for pay or profit. They do not include things as time use or status of contracts, types of contracts. And I think including those measures would give a different sense of, how women contribute to the economy, even if it's not included or monetized, as they said.
I'm glad you have defined that a bit for us, Sharon. And as you said, most people are not aware of this concept at all. The very idea that many workers in India are actually participate in unpaid economic work, and that is especially true for women. And since we are talking about unpaid work, we have to address the elephant in the room, which really does keep women from India in participating in work. And that is that women here spend most of their time on cooking and cleaning and taking care of the family. While this is true for women everywhere, in India, it is particularly acute. We can look at data from even South Asia, a country like Sri Lanka. 54% of men participate in unpaid domestic services in the household, and 20% participate in caregiving. While in India, this figure is 26% and 14%. And this has become worse since the pandemic. We also know that it is this unpaid domestic and care work by women which allows men to go out and to do work for which they get paid. So, what do you think can be done to recognize the work that women do, and how can we support women for unpaid care work?
I think there's a lot of scope to do an advance in this domain. I think the first key for unpaid work is great awareness about what is considered unpaid work and realize that it's a valid contribution, even if there's no monetary result. That also means that within the household, women themselves need to realize, men need to realize, and as well, I think in terms of people who devise policies, collect data on this, they also need to be better at be able to isolate that. I think our usual classic way of calculating economic indicators through GDP doesn't really work in this case. I think one needs to think through how you can measure this differently, account for it, and make them women more visible in terms of their time use what you do. So I think the ideal way would actually, in a lot of these surveys, and I think they started to integrate these in some of the services, these time use surveys, which are extremely useful, that you can actually measure the amount of time that women spend on unpaid work, whether it's taking care of children, taking care of work on the farm. And often it sort of like underestimates, because women often do several things at a time. At once, they can take care of the children and work in the farm and things like that. So the ideal would be to understand, how to put a price, how to measure this time accurately by observing women, indicating to them what is unpaid work, asking them directly as well to self-report, understanding women in their context. When do you want to elevate that and put a price on that, I think, and calculating the opportunity cost or replacement cost to see, what is the value of it. I think that would be the first thing. The second thing is that sometimes it's difficult to capture that because people don't realize that this is actually valid work, like cooking or taking care of children, etc. It's something become expected. So that's also when it creates the awareness to see, no, this actually is a contribution if it's not monetized. And as well, also making sure that people understand, the variations, the seasonality, and all these volatilities sometimes in time uses that occur in women's life stage. I think if you address those issues, that will go a long way. I think collecting data through the time use service is key. But there's as well other measures. I think ideally one would want to reduce the time that women have on unpaid care work and balance it out. While it's fair to say that women deserve to be recognized and have sort of like a value to their unpaid care work, it's also good as well for those who want to work to find ways to how to reduce the unpaid care work. So this would be also a way to make more women visible. When you see some of these schemes that help to improve water access or anything, helps retrieve like childcare or something that would help reduce their time. That will also allow women to have more visibility, more access to time for employment and things like that, more equitable childcare, maternity policies, and as well, and I think this might be a long way to go, but maybe even within a household, more equitable distribution between unpaid work between men and women can certainly address the issue from those points.
As you said, it's not just about attributing value to the work they do, which is very essential. Also, the question of awareness, that people are often not aware that there is value to this work. And that's not just the family and the men, it's also the women sometimes who do not think that the work and the time that they spend doing these chores at home have any value. But about the point that you made about reducing the time that they spend, can you think of any measures, a successful policy, and that could be in India or even outside, where we have seen it being implemented effectively?
Well, I can tell you a Canadian one since I'm here back home. So I think I was also raised by a single mother, and I think what helped a lot is childcare. I think childcare was one of the key things, and not only regular childcare but subsidized childcare. I think that's one of the key areas that I think that would help a lot reduce time women's unpaid work. As well, I think ways that one can think that could help optimize and facilitate a woman's care of the household. I think people have been distributing these LPG cylinders, and there's a few examples of that. Those are good examples. And I think it has to be sort of like one of those multi-pronged strategies. There's a few ways that can, nudge in the right direction, but I think you need to have a balanced approach of many things that you can do at once to achieve that.
So, about childcare, I should in fact bring up that this is a topic to which we will be dedicating one of our subsequent episodes because it is a very important issue in India. You did talk about time use survey. And just for our listeners, I'd want to talk a little about that and how that has taken us in this direction where we have started at least thinking about the time that women are spending on these tasks in India. India's last time use survey, or rather even we could call it the first comprehensive all India study, was done in 2019. And the one that was done before that was a pilot one, if I'm correct, Sharon, and that was done 20 years ago. So it took us 20 years to prioritize what is clearly a very important study, which tells us how is it that women are spending their time in the day. And that is important for the economy as well, which actually brings me to a question that I want to ask you as someone who is an economist and who looks at a lot of data on gender and development. Along with women missing from the workforce is the issue of missing data on women, and the two are interlinked. The production of gender statistics has not been a priority in India, and it is underfunded in most countries for that matter. Can you tell us a little about the major gaps in the data that we are collecting on women and girls in the country, and why is it that we need good gender data?
Thanks. Well, again, I think we need good data in general, timely data and relevant data. I think that's quite important for any economy that wants to assess itself. Gender data in particular, and I think like I had articulated in previous questions, is that I think women have different contexts, and it's important to understand their particular socioeconomic context and to devise indicators that would be collected for both gender, but not necessarily the same indicators. I think that would be important to acknowledge. I think it's important to look at gender data, not only as economists. I often see people who do gender and they do this infamous table, men and women, and they start comparing. But I think we should go way beyond that. We have to look at women's issue and understand what is the data that goes with it, and also compare how is it different from men issues, and highlight, how to either maybe, improve on women's thing or decrease a gap that could be decreased. And it's through the full range of life cycle, I think. Even understanding, how they access education, quality education, how women try to get jobs that could be different than men, how women use public transport could be very different, how you collect data on safety at home for women or in public spaces could be in a very different context, and be very useful to understand, explains things like I mentioned that are very interconnected. I highlighted a little bit above, how one thinks about why employment is low. There's a several range of these factors. It'd be good to have a little bit more data that explains what are these contributing factors and what are the relevant reports in them and the combination of them. I think one other aspect is that it should span across the different surveys that India has is collecting already. So across our population and housing census, our household health and well-being, income and experience survey, I think topics on poverty, even civil registration, distribution income, and in particular the labor force survey, which we are often using, and the time use surveys. And I would say there's not just one gender gap or one can pickpocket. I think if we mainstream it through any data that we collect, in particular, and it's just tweaking it a little bit and thinking a little bit differently from a different perspective, I think that would already be a great contribution. And when we talk about data, often we focus on the data collection itself. So we look at, saying that, okay, let's collect data. But I think we need to understand the gender gap is also in terms of data collection, data analysis, and data dissemination. And I think data is important, but if you don't analyze it with the right gender lens angle, or if you do not disseminate it in the right context, it sort of like misses the greater purpose on this. So it's important that one thinks of gender gap, one thinks of how to collect, women-centric information across, the mainstream data they collect, but as well, how one shows the analysis of it, interprets it, and how disseminates it. It could be in different areas, different venues, different angles. And I think one key important thing that we often think of like gender data in terms of like economic surveys, but one of the emerging data, like for example, digital data, or often, this huge context of machine learning and artificial intelligence, they are using historical data, and those data are often highly, concentrated on men, because women initially, historically, didn't have as much data collected from them. So a lot of the algorithms that are coming from these machine learning or any other artificial intelligences that they're forming now in algorithm could have a potential bias on that. So I just wanted to think as well as that, when we look at other types of data and gender gaps, we also need to consider what are the forward-thinking way that people are using data or collecting data and where they're collecting it. And as well, I think we have been experimenting at LEAD as well, other types of data innovation where we're highly cognizant, for example, to make sure that we include gender data. So, for example, we're trying to do analysis of conversations of people and within the context of men and women, and to see what emerges in topics in finance and entrepreneurship, etc.
That's right. And in fact, there is a fascinating book that has been lying with me, and I have to get to it. I'm not sure if you've read it, Sharon, Invisible Women, that came out on gender data for those of our listeners who actually are interested in this topic. Did you read it?
I started to read, and I think they touch on these topics as well, beyond just collecting the data, but how people use it, the big data, etc., these algorithms that
Yes, and also the biases that exist in design of products. I remember one of the famous examples that the author takes up is of car crashes and car safety, and how all of those are tested on men. And that is why cars are less safe for women. And that just goes to show that data and gender data is important in ways that we're not even thinking of. But my hope is, Sharon, that perhaps the pandemic has managed to bring some of this to the forefront. We know that if we want to frame good policies or effective programs, we do need data. And we are having this conversation 2 years into the pandemic, which we know has been devastating for women socially and economically. Women have had to take on additional domestic and care burden during this time. The informal economy, which employs the majority of women in India, has been the worst hit. India Spend has reported on women who've had to work multiple jobs to sustain themselves and their families during this time. Like the story of Mona and Kishori, two women in their 30s who work as light carriers at weddings in Varanasi. These women would earn 10,000 rupees before the pandemic and worked for 6 days a week. Now they are earning 1,500 to 2,000 rupees and are struggling to find work. We also know that sectors that have been the most affected in the pandemic, from restaurants to retail, beauty, tourism, education, domestic work, and care work, have high female employment. Can you talk about how the pandemic has widened prevailing gender gaps in India, and how has it affected women's access to opportunities and resources?
Thanks, Sina. I think you articulated most of sort of like the impact that have caused women. I would say, in addition to that, I think this pandemic has sort of like reversed decades of progress that women have made towards gender equality. So I think that some of the points you articulated, while women were sort of like a little bit marginally better, it really pushed back sort of like women's causes far behind. It's look, we took several step backs. I think, and it take a little time to recover. I think there's a few measures that one needs to take. So one thing is that at IWWAGE and at least we're actively working in to make sure that government integrate women very specifically and with gender specific lens in any economic recovery measure. I think we also need to figure out ways to alleviate unpaid work burden, because I think since it has increased for women, there's a danger since, they cannot find work or jobs, they become more even synced into that. One aspect as well is there is a loss of savings for women, because women are even more vulnerable given that they have faced income stability, but they also face lack of social protection, having, perhaps to, use their savings. Maybe even often more poor women would have to sell off their bangles or something like that. So whatever their collateral is not there, they have less wealth. They're more in a dangerous position. They also preventing from, even starting a business when you need collateral and things like that. When you have no more collateral, no more savings, no more wealth accumulation, you have less opportunities. So, and they're also not that representative women entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship in general. So there's a danger for that. I think it's very important that the government has clear focus on helping women access finance, access social protection, in addition to making sure that they're well integrated in any economic recovery. Another area that we might not think of, but I think it could open a new terrain of like gender inequality, is looking at all of these hybrid remote work culture where the laws of how we work are not well defined. So you often have women that might say, okay, because it helps in a way reduce mobility, because women would not have to, probably, travel to work, and people are used to now, and we've been getting a lot of questions on this culture of working from home and things like that, which makes them a good solution. Other aspects that opens, it could also be that women might be bottled, cased into a particular type of work, or they might not be promoted as much because they not go as much in the office. There might also be, ways where we've heard cases where women are not as comfortable maybe speaking out loud, or also like being muted, like, in video calls or something like that. So I think there's a lot of scope to understand how women in this post-pandemic phase would fare into a hybrid remote culture. What are the conditions? What are the pros and cons into that? I think the private sector has a huge role as well. I think government can do policies and things like that, but I think it's important that the private sector enables this by any job creation measure they will take. And I think there's scope as well to see, explore like cash transfer schemes or something like that of that order to help supplement income until women become more stable, particularly for those who have lost their job.
Right. And that actually gives me the segue into a question that I have wanted to ask you. What happens to women after the pandemic? Because it truly has changed the world of work. And I'd like to wind up this conversation by looking ahead. And when we do that, we have to look at digitization, and more so in the last 2 years. It has also brought out the gender digital divide in India, which we are thinking of now more and more. According to one study, Indian women are 15% less likely to own a mobile phone and 33% less likely to use mobile internet services than men. And the gap is worse in rural India. Can digitization be an equalizer for Indian women, as is often promised? Can it open up opportunities that were not available to them? And then how can we make sure that no one is left out of this?
Well, first we need to, make sure that people have access to phones, able to use it, and have internet. So, but those are not sufficient conditions. I think that there are a roster of other things that one needs to sort of like look into, especially in terms of looking at the gender aspect. So the social norm is huge. We often know that women, although they have a phone for the house, or even if they have a phone, they might not be able to access it or use it all the time, or might need permission. So I think those are the things of understanding, women's agency, their behavior in the context, etc. We also need to make sure that just very practical aspects, just like maybe making online content more in vernacular language to make sure that it reaches out to women in rural areas. They might be more open to look at this. And what I mean is that there might be a lot of entertainment in vernacular language, but there might be not job opportunities or other aspects that are not there. So you almost need to have like a several pronged strategies because people are on a different journey. So the spectrum of digital readiness is huge across population in general, but across women in particular, where there's women at a stage that you have women who do not use a cell phone, and you have a range of women, depending on age, that are very versatile on social media, very comfortable, etc. So you need to devise sort of like strategy for everyone's journey. So one who's starting to get acquainted to understand. You also have a bunch that also starting to have access phone, but mobile phone, but don't necessarily understand how to optimize it or how to go about it. There's also very practical issues. When we've done fieldwork in the domain, we realize that women who have young teenage boys are much more probable of taking much more usage of the phone for different aspects. I guess there's a technology generation barrier to that certainly helps. But we do know that women are interested in getting digital. There might not be as open. I remember when we did some digital camps in a slum just outside of Jaipur for women. And although they are not forthcoming, my field staff found a group of women who started their WhatsApp group, and they started by exchanging coupons and understanding that if you're able to get online, you can save money and things like that. So I guess it's creating opportunities and cases for them. And when you talk about digital, when people have multiple opportunities to use it, the more they have, the better the uptake will be. So I think, and if that catches on, I think there's a range of things that are interesting for women, because when you talk about the opportunity cost of time, so women are burdened with a lot of, work at home and things like that. So if they can do a range of things at their household very simply, so there's an opportunity cost of time, I think there could be an interesting behavioral influence where women can educate themselves, create awareness as well. It also could help mobility in the sense that, for example, if women get online and get very good into paying everything digital, so students' education fees can be paid online with UPI, etc., having them well versed in that. If they're well versed in as business people, maybe even understanding their bargaining power through, e-commerce platforms and things like that. So I think while the divide is huge, I think that what they have to gain could be immense in this. And I think what's the key thing for digital, I think, to overcome is to understand that, like I mentioned, every one section is on a different journey, and it's important to acknowledge and have a solution for all of them. Eventually, that will converge.
Sharon, I have about 10 follow-up questions to everything that you've just told us, but we're out of time, and this has been fascinating to hear. Thank you so much for taking our time for this conversation. It's been a pleasure to have you join us.
Thanks a lot, Sunaina. This is always a pleasure to discuss, like I mentioned, this support issue. And I wish all the best for the podcast, and I hope people still remain engaged in this important topic. Yeah.
I certainly hope so. And thank you to our listeners. If you like this episode, please follow our show, Mind the Gender Gap, on your favorite podcast app or platform. The show is available on IVM Podcast Network and on all major podcast streaming platforms. And please tell a friend about us. We will be back next month, and we hope that you will be there.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Advertising is Dead, foodpreneur and chef Saransh Koila joins Varun to talk about his latest venture, Bombay Meal Rolls. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam speaks to Ashwin Patni, head product and alternatives at Axis AMC. They discuss ELSS investing in India. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth highlights lessons we should all learn from the Tinder Swindler documentary. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshav takes us on a tour of Dubai's grand malls. And on Say No to Drama, Chetna talks about our relationship with money. So, on a personal note, I wanted to let you all know that this week marks the 7th anniversary since I started IVM. I'm eternally grateful to the team we have here, especially Kavita Rajwade and Tejas Sringarpure, who have been here since the beginning. They've seen the struggles, our eventual acquisition by Pratilipi, and our continued struggles to make podcasting a large and thriving part of the media industry. We have the best hosts in the world, and I have to say that I'm so glad and so grateful that they have chosen to work with us. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to you, the millions of folks who have heard or watched our content. All I can say is, you ain't seen nothing yet. I hope you join us as we continue this journey. In the meanwhile, do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform you're listening to. You can also check us out on YouTube. To get a list of all of our channels, you can go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, where you can go to all the channels. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life, Bank of Baroda, Max Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
We know you love fast food,
fast fashion,
faster payment,
lightning fast internet speed.
Then why not fast information?
On Think Fast, where we discuss the latest developments in the world of technology, business, marketing, pop culture.
With a side of sarcasm and my dad jokes, not just mine.
Not mine, Varun. My jokes are funny. So join me, guys, the funnier one, Suchita Salvan, co-founder of LBB.
And me, Varun Tugirala, the co-founder of The Glitch, as we think fast only on the IVM network.
Fresh episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.